Well, welcome everybody once again to the briefing room. And I am continuing my Women in War series. And today we are going to be talking to Hanna Diamond. Hannah, welcome to the briefing room.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. And we're going to be talking about your Josephine Baker's Secret War book, which I found an excellent read. I knew about Josephine Baker, but I didn't know about that side of her. And how did you come across that side of her, and what made you think this is something I really want to write about?
Well, actually, I am a specialist on the Second World War period of history in France, and I've written quite a lot about women's lives and women's experience during the Second World War. So I was commissioned to do some preliminary research into Josephine Baker, and I have to admit, to my horror, that I didn't know about this side of her activities. It was when I started this research, it was a bit of a eureka moment. Goodness, there's a real story here. And what was even more extraordinary was that there was no scholarly work about this period of her life. There's quite a lot of work that's been done about her earlier life, her arrival in Paris, and the extraordinary career she made for herself, as I'm sure we'll go on to talk about in music hall and then also in film. And there's also quite a lot of scholarly, interesting work about her post-war life and the work she did for the civil rights movement. But this period of her life during the Second World War, which I would argue is quite crucial to understanding who she was in her entirety, there seemed to be a really big gap there. So once I'd realised that, I was lucky enough to get a fellowship from the Leverhulme Trust, and I set out to follow the archival trail and find what I could.
Great. Well, it is a fantastic read, like I say. And if we go back to when she was 11, how did the St. Louis riots shape how she grew up and shaped how she was in the civil rights movement, how active she was?
Well, as you've said, Josephine Baker was brought up in St. Louis. She was born in June 1906. In fact, we're coming up for the 100th anniversary of her birth, and into a really impoverished and difficult background. Brought up, her father left the household very early on, brought up by her mum, who also had aspirations actually to be involved in music hall, but didn't. And she was a she took in washing, and she put Josephine Baker into service very young. So Josephine was part of that very difficult background for African Americans eking a life. And she was 11, as you said, when she witnessed these riots, which were very, very frightening for African Americans. She saw them over the river here, where there had been a huge influx of African American workers coming to St. Louis, finding work, and white mobs feeling very threatened, really went for them, and many were killed. And even troops who were sent in to control went over the other side and ended up fighting them. So I think she gained from this experience, which was very traumatic and frightening, a sense that the US wasn't a safe place for blacks to live, and that US citizens weren't going to be protected by the government, and that she was going to have to look out for number one and try and make her way in this very difficult environment of segregation. And it's sort of it when she gets to France in 1925 and realizes how different it is. I think she had been so marked by that earlier experience, it highlighted for her the advantages that Europe had to offer. And she would go on, of course, and end up living in France in the longer term.
Well, she went to France when she was 19.
Yes.
And what American vaudeville skills had she learned in the US that the French didn't get to see?
Well, she was able, miraculously, really, to get herself out of this very deprived and difficult background. She'd been, her mother had put her in service in white households, but she had this flair for dance and she was able to be picked up by vaudeville troupes and actually ended up on the New York stage. And it was quite a harsh apprenticeship, I think. She was on the chorus line and you had to be very disciplined and understand rhythm. And but she didn't just dance on the chorus line. Often she was put at the end. So she took what she'd learnt and sort of subverted it in a way. There's film that you can see on YouTube of her on the end of a chorus line, kind of taking that rhythm and making it her own, pretending she's tripped or lost the steps and going cross-eyed. So all that training, she sort of took it on and made it her own, so that when she came to Paris and performed this extraordinary danse sauvage, she was selected, she was seen in New York and brought to Paris as part of the Revue Nègre. And she did solos, and her dancing style immediately drew attention. Not all Parisians loved the way she danced. It was provocative, seductive, but she tapped into a real interest that there was at that time for jazz, for what Parisians saw as being, I think, African art, and dance and music. And so when her show opened and people saw this rather scantily dressed woman carried onto the stage at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, which is carried on by a black dancer, placed on the stage. And she went into this extraordinary, frenetic, electrifying dance where she moved her body in the most extraordinary way. And everyone was aghast. Some people loved it, some people were deeply shocked, but embedded in that style was this deep training that she'd undergone in American vaudeville. And she sort of made it her own and translated into this style that would make her name. And she would become, on the back of that, very rich and a huge celebrity in a way she couldn't have even begun to imagine in segregated America.
In research for this chat, I've watched videos on YouTube, and it's really difficult to take your eyes off her. She's just so central to everything that she does, and she's amazing. And why was the 1920s Paris the perfect storm for Josephine's success?
Well, as I said, I think it was a moment of time where the First World War had marked. I mean, a whole generation of French men were lost in that tragic experience, and it was over. So it was a period where people wanted to live and discover and party. And there was, as I said, this real interest in Africa, the French Empire. There were many African colonial areas there, and there was a real push towards an admiration of African art, trying to better understand the kind of French, it was called the mission civilisatrice. What was it that the French were doing? What were they bringing to the Africans? This notion of the kind of noble savage, if you like. And Josephine, with this dancing, she cast herself in the role of being this child of the empire also, almost, and tapped into a kind of colonial unconscious, the kind of fantasy that the French had that created this huge storm around her activities, and she just became an obsession of the French press as well. So the timing was right. She wasn't actually the only jazz artist to make a name for herself. She was probably the most famous, but many African American musicians, nightclub owners, all found that interwar Paris was a very receptive place for them by comparison with segregated America.
And how did her partner, Pepito, Papito Albertino,
Yes, that's right.
how did he transform her from a dancer to an iconic global brand?
Well, he was quite remarkable. He passed himself off as a count, and he wasn't really a count. He was a simple Sicilian farmer, but he understood the potential that Josephine Baker had. Here was this, I mean, very young, 19-year-old who'd suddenly sort of emerged onto the music hall scene and was adored very quickly, had a huge following with Parisian crowds. She hadn't had a lot of education. I mean, she could barely read and write, and certainly couldn't communicate in French at the beginning. So he arranged for her to learn. He brought in tutors. He arranged for her. He helped her use her celebrity position, if you like, to better herself. And she was very much keen to do this. She learned to sing. She was the darling of the literati. She was surrounded by fashion designers, the surrealists. So she had access really to the great and the good. And Pepito, she learned to sing, he put her on the stage, she moved away from this rather exotic, barely dressed form of dance to much more traditional music hall. She did a silent film, she became a film star. She did a film in 1927, and he was very active in promoting her. She'd go on to do two more talking films in the mid 30s. And he kind of made her into a prophet. She advertised. She had this kind of androgynous look about her with short hair, and he put products that she used on her hair on the market, and people bought it in droves. This was the period, the French call it la garçonne, this sort of period where Josephine Baker fit. She would wear tuxedos and suits. She really fitted in, and with Pepita's help, I think, marketed herself beautifully. Postcards circulated everywhere of her, and she kind of epitomized the modernistic feeling of the turn that art and dance was taking. And Pepita really was able to tap into that and help her improve herself, I suppose, for want of a better word, and mastermind it all.
That's amazing that she was like that, because virtually every big celebrity is like that now. So she was sort of a front runner for all of that.
Yeah, she was. I mean, I do sometimes think of her as one of our first celebrities, really, because
Mm.
she also loved animals and she had this huge menagerie of animals. And she would walk down the Champs-Élysées with a cheetah as a publicity stunt originally given to her by one of the directors of the Casino de Paris to advertise one of her shows. But there she was walking down the Champs-Élysées in all her furs, very much the celebrity. This cheetah on a lead with a diamond collar. We're kind of used to that celebrity culture. And of course, she'd go on to adopt lots of children. It puts us in mind of contemporary celebrities, but
Yeah.
she was the first one to do it. I mean, and I did think she was the very first. But then I went to a wonderful exhibition in Paris a few years ago about Sarah Bernhardt. And she also had this extraordinary celebrity persona.
Mm.
But I think Josephine Baker was very much in that image of becoming instantly recognizable. She was
Yeah.
given a car, and the people of Paris would flood around watching her learn to drive. And she thrived on it all. She
Mhm.
would talk to journalists, she was very gracious, and she cultivated this very eccentric star personality.
Yeah, made me smile when she's taking the animals everywhere with her, and she can't be without them. With World War II looming and her love of France, she became a French citizen. Did she become a French citizen for survival, or was it a very personal to her to become a citizen of France.
Well, I think Josephine Baker, she had this extraordinary success in France, and Albertino had arranged for her to have tours around the rest of Europe where she was also very successful, not without controversy. I mean, and also in Germany and Austria, she had brushes with the Nazis who weren't yet in power.
Mm-hmm.
She was there in the late 20s, but she came to understand the dangers of Nazism. I mean, there were hecklers in her shows. There was a lot of discussion. She was seen as a kind of black devil, and the Nazis saw jazz music as very decadent. So she realized that the Nazis had her in, she would be in danger in the event of a war. And she also longed for success in America. Albertino did arrange for her to go to America in 1936, and it was an absolute disaster. You know, the Americans were so imbued with the racism of segregation. They just, you know, they just didn't understand Josephine Baker. They didn't appreciate the way she danced. They didn't understand why she was so successful in Europe. You know, she was for them stepping out of the stereotypical African American female roles that they felt she should adopt. And she really was very disappointed. She came back to France at the end of that tour. She was absolutely furious with Albertino. Actually, it was rather sad because he was dying in cancer, and she'd sent him back to France in disgrace. And by the time she herself returned, he died. It was a cancer he hadn't told her about. So after that failure, I think Josephine Baker decided to focus on the theatre that was France and Europe, that did enjoy her and did appreciate her, and really the crowds adored her. So in 1907, when she met Jean Lion, a kind of playboy, very rich industrialist, Jewish, I think she decided to marry. She had initially a fantasy of settling down with him, and she was very attracted to Judaism. Her family actually told me that she did make some effort to convert. It's very difficult though, but she carried a Jewish prayer book around with her. She became very fond of Leon's mother. The marriage failed, of course, but at their wedding, she did take French nationality and renounced her American nationality. Now, I think Nazism was probably a consideration then. I mean, being involved with Jewish people at that time, the Nazis in power, she understood the threat. She could see firsthand what was going on through contacts of the Lyon family. But I think she genuinely had a sense of allegiance to France. The French had made her incredibly famous and opened doors for her in ways she could never have had access to the people, to the money, the riches, to the lifestyle. She had a home in Le Vessinet. She had wonderful homes in Paris. She could never have aspired to any of that in America. So I think she did really want to participate in French society.
Why was she so adamant about being a member of high society?
Well, I think she she had come from nowhere, let's face it, and
Mm-hmm.
it was a remarkable story, and she wanted acceptance. I don't know whether we can call the Lyon family high society. They were kind of industrial, nouveau riche, but it gave her access, like Josephine Baker learned to fly and Jean Lion flew, and you can see the newspaper reports of the time, her and Jean Lion, pictures of them going off on an aeroplane together. They could travel together. It kind of, his lifestyle kind of complemented her lifestyle. However, he wanted her to stop performing. I mean, there are interviews in fact, in the Daily Mail that I picked up where she says very soon after their marriage, "Oh, this is my final tour." Throughout her life, she was always doing final tours. "This is my farewell tour. My husband, I'm going to settle down and be a good wife." But she couldn't do it, and he didn't like her being out on the road, and I think that was one of the reasons the marriage failed. They divorced in 1941. but he's still around. He's still an important figure, actually, in the background.
Oh wow.
And she helps his family escape to North Africa during the
Hmm.
war. So she remains friends with his family for the rest of her life. So although the marriage failed, she did create a network and an access to that Jewish side of her existence. And when she goes to Jerusalem, actually during the war, she talks about her affinity with the Jewish people and sees herself as being doubly discriminated in a sense, both as an African American woman and as her sense of allegiance to Judaism. So it's very interesting, very important to her. And so I think that marriage is quite crucial for understanding what comes later.
And talking about what comes later, can you explain a little bit about the Deuxième Bureau and why they decided to recruit Josephine Baker?
So yes, Josephine Baker stays. It's really important to note that she stays in France after the outbreak of the war. As war is looming, the American embassy starts to warn those African Americans who, some of whom had been in the US for a had been in France for a long time, made their lives there very comfortable, but they understood the dangers they faced from Nazism. And by the time the war breaks out in September 1939, most have gone. But Josephine Baker doesn't leave, she stays because she has French nationality and she feels that she has a duty to stay with France and fight on the side of the allies, on the side of the French and the British. And almost immediately after the outbreak of war, she throws herself into patriotic acts. She adopts loads of French soldiers on the Maginot Line. She becomes their symbolic godmother. She sends them parcels. She does good work. She volunteers. She gives impoverished children parcels at Christmas. And she participates in a show at the Casino de Paris with Maurice Chevalier, actually, celebrating the Franco-British Entente called Paris-London, which is a kind of collaboration between the two, because there are a lot of British soldiers also posted to France. The British Expeditionary Forces are present also. They, in their time off, also, there are articles in the British press, go and see Josephine Baker and Maurice Chevalier. And around this time, she does get an approach from Jacques Apthé, who's head of the Deuxième Bureau, the kind of military counterintelligence area. He's head of the Paris region, and he's been in that role since 1936. So his concern is to understand the presence of German agents, what's going on in counterintelligence in France, because of course, the war breaks out in September 1939, but we're in this period of the phony war where everyone thinks initially that something extraordinary is going to happen, but nothing, there's this long wait, this very odd period. Now, initially, Jacques Abté, like us, thinks this extraordinary star who's known wherever she goes, being an informer for the Deuxième Bureau, being a spy, essentially, normally we think of spies as kind of melting into the background and
Hmm.
passing
Yeah.
unnoticed. And this wasn't at all the case for Josephine Baker. So Jacques Apthé, when her name is suggested to him, initially he's a bit skeptical. Also, we have to remember that the French secret services had had rather bad experiences of female spies who were performers. I'm thinking of Mata Hari, who of
Mm.
course ended up being shot. However, he is persuaded to go and meet with her. And the Josephine Baker he meets is a very different sort of figure. She's dressed very simply in her home, in wonderful villa in Le Vessinet, and she speaks to him very movingly about the debt she feels she owes the French. And she says, something along the lines of, the French have made me what I am, and I'm prepared to give they've given me their hearts, I will give them my life. And he thinks, well, she's clearly motivated.
Mhm.
He decides to give her a try. So Josephine Baker is obviously solicited everywhere, and she manages to contrive to get invitations to the Italian and Japanese embassy. The Italians had a bit of a soft spot for her because rather ill-advisedly she'd expressed support for Mussolini and in the invasion of Abyssinia in 1936. Anyway, she gets an invitation into the embassy. Of course, the Allies are very keen to know what the Italians are thinking and doing about the war. Is Mussolini going to join forces with Hitler? And she goes to this reception, and all these diplomats and embassy officials are completely starstruck. So she can talk to them and she, pushes them. And what do people say? What's going on in Italian circles? And she then picks up information that she reports back to Jacques Abté. And it said that she rushes off to the ladies and writes things down on her arms. That's what she puts in her memoirs. Obviously, we can't verify that, but it's a lovely story. And similarly, in the Japanese embassy, she's able to pick up information from unsuspecting officials. And Abté is impressed. I mean, he thinks there's something here. And so he decides to take her on and he becomes her handler and trains her in the ways and means of spycraft. And that then is the beginning of a partnership in every sense, actually. They do
Mhm.
also become lovers that will last for most of the war. That after the fall of France, Josephine Baker operates first based in France and then very quickly into North Africa, which falls under the Vichy government. And she and Abte are able to move around, and she is in a very good position to collect and transmit intelligence material. She can see what's going on, but also Abte's superiors pass on information for her to take first to the British and later to the Americans. And in the latter part of the war, after 1942, when the Americans have invaded North Africa, she goes on acting in a clandestine role, this time reporting more directly to the Gaullists, to de Gaulle. So she uses her celebrity as a cover, if you like, to be able to carry out these espionage activities. And this is the work she does under the aegis of the Deuxième Bureau.
And while she was in North Africa doing some great work, she had a miscarriage and she suffered from sepsis, which put her in hospital for a very long time. And how did that change her status in Free France?
Yes, well, Josephine Baker was able to work quite effectively. She even did some missions on her own, actually. Remarkably, she never fell under suspicion, which is extraordinary, but everyone was taken in by this eccentric celebrity image she had. Until, as you say, early July 1941, when she falls really dangerously ill. I mean, actually, we don't know exactly why it was. There are all sorts of theories, but yes, she is very near death, and she's hospitalized in Casablanca in a clinic there because by this point she and Abte are working in mainly in Morocco, passing on information about what's happening there, and passing on information that's coming in from mainland France. But she does, I mean, she is really very seriously ill, right up really until the Americans arrive in November 1942. But she has periods of where she rallies, periods of convalescence. And remarkably, as there are Americans now in North Africa, the beginnings of the Office for Strategic Services sends in American vice consuls. This is their sort of uh, public name, public persona to oversee a trade agreement, but actually secretly they're collecting information to prepare to lay the groundwork for what will be Operation Torch. And they hear about Josephine Baker, this African-American star who's present in Casablanca. And what could be more normal than uh, an American vice consul going into a clinic to get news of how is this wonderful star doing today? And while they're in her hospital bedroom, Abte contrives for them to meet certain members of the resistance that the Americans are trying to encourage, members of the Deuxième Bureau, agents who've come in from mainland France, and also sympathetic Muslim dignitaries. Josephine Baker has a huge entourage. Her celebrity allows her to tap in to all these different people and there they are, able to meet secretly around her hospital bed. So even in the throes of her misfortune, she is able to act as a facilitator for what is to come and contribute to the Allied cause. And indeed, I found newspaper articles and testimony by a certain Lieutenant Paul Jensen, who says that her contribution to the securing of Morocco after the invasion during Operation Torch was absolutely crucial for them. She was able to give them the names of German and Italian members, agents, members of the Armistice Commission, who were able then to be arrested and helped American counterintelligence in their mission to secure the area. So much so that he was given, awarded a Silver Star. So she really played a very crucial role even during this period of illness.
It's a wonder that she isn't named in more history books then, isn't it? When like history books about North Africa, it's a wonder that she isn't named in there.
Well, I
So
think that much of this work, I'd like to think that I've contributed to bringing some of it to
yeah,
light, but
definitely.
much of this record was very much overlooked, really. I think she was such a huge star that people, and this is very common. I found this in my work on women in the French resistance. You know, there was a bit of a flurry of discussion about what women had done in the immediate post-war period, but it sort of settled into, was overshadowed by other things. And Josephine Baker herself didn't really talk about it a great deal. She
Mhm.
did get medals in the post-war period. It was only really, I think, when President Macron decided to make her into a national hero, and I think we may come on to talk about that a bit more, and move her ashes symbolically to the Pantheon. And there was a huge ceremony around this in November 2021.
Mhm.
And then her war record really came to light, and people started to ask questions about it. But I think certainly in the contemporary world, this activity, and certainly for French people, had passed really unnoticed
Mm.
until then.
That's why books like yours are so important to bring these stories to the forefront.
Well, I hope so. I hope I can contribute to that.
Definitely. Could you talk a little bit about, and this is what I found ingenious about her, some of the methods she used to smuggle messages across the border?
Yes, well, Josephine Baker had this huge advantage that here we are in a time of war and borders are shut. But Josephine Baker could, she used the ploy of saying, "Oh, I need to go to Portugal to do a concert tour and to meet my impresario so I can plan a tour in South America." And she was able to get the visas she needed to be able to go there. And these visas were very difficult to acquire. Let's remember what's happening. Many of those who fell foul of the Nazis and even the Vichy regime were trapped in Marseille, trapped in Casablanca, trapped in Lisbon because they didn't have the papers they needed to be able to escape. And there is Josephine Baker able to move around. Now, she was able also to help others move around. And in the the early stages of their collaboration, Jacques Abday also benefited from Josephine Baker's freedom of movement by acting as her secretary. And he would travel with her. Everyone would be, there's a wonderful story of the Spanish border that everyone is so amazed to see Josephine Baker arrive at the border controls. All the border guards go and fetch their wives who staying locally. Come and get Josephine Baker's here. Come and get her autograph. That Jacques Abte, who is traveling with her as her secretary and has in her briefcase, so the story goes, I haven't been able to verify this, but this is what they say, coded secrets written in invisible ink on her song sheets. And he is able to pass through those border controls without anyone paying him the slightest bit of attention, because all the focus is on this great star. And so it is throughout the war that Josephine Baker is able to move around, pick up information, and she would write little notes and hide it on her person because she had this aura about her, which meant, and she says this in her memoirs, no one would ever dare to search Josephine Baker. So she would use that celebrity very explicitly to collect information and get it to those who needed it, using the techniques of espionage, which may or may not have been a little embellished in those memoirs.
Well, as you said it earlier, it's completely the opposite from a spy, isn't it? It's like she's out there, she's in the spotlight rather than in the shadows, really, which I found amazing.
Well, she's literally hiding in plain sight, isn't
Yeah,
she?
yeah.
Because people, and as I said, it's extraordinary. I mean, I think also the fact that she's African American plays to her advantage in a way because nobody expects someone like her could possibly
Mm.
be involved in these kinds of activities. And it was similarly with women in the resistance. Initially, it never occurred to the Nazis that women could be doing anything more than walking their children in a pram round the town when in fact they had possibly ammunition or clandestine press hidden under the baby. It just, it's that kind of way in which Josephine Baker exploited not just her gender, but her celebrity to do this incredible work and dangerous work. Because if
Oh,
she'd
yeah,
been
yeah.
uncovered, she would have been in very serious trouble. So she was incredibly courageous too.
And what did wearing the Free France uniform signify for her identity after liberation?
Yes, well, Josephine Baker is in May 1944 in recognition of the work she does. Josephine Baker does an awful lot after the Operation Torch. She finally recovers from this awful illness and starts to do concert tours, entertaining Americans, she does a tour for ENSA, the British entertainment, and she also obviously entertaining the Free French, but also promoting de Gaulle at this point. She is an ardent Gaullist. She works very hard to fundraise and promote de Gaulle. De Gaulle is it's not a given that the Americans are going to accept de Gaulle, and she does a lot of work to promote him. And she even does an extraordinary tour of the Middle East, actually, that I talk about in my book, where she and Abte travel in jeeps across the desert all the way through the Middle East to Egypt, and then they go up into the Lebanon. And she's using these trips to promote de Gaulle and report back to the Gaullists on what she's seeing. And, this is the time, the beginning of decolonization. There are independence movements. The British are wheeler dealing a bit for their, jostling for their position in the post-war world. And there's quite a lot of tension going on between France and Britain. And Josephine Baker is reporting back on all these experiences, which are valuable to the Gaullists. So in recognition of this incredible work, they make her a second lieutenant of the Auxiliary French Air Force. Let's remember Josephine Baker can fly, and she's very committed and fond of the Air Force. So Josephine Baker surfaces, she goes back to France in October 1944, and there she is in uniform. She's the representation of the French patriot, very recognizable image. There's a wonderful picture of her arriving in Marseille in uniform, and the caption on the image of her in her uniform is, "Do you recognize her?" Because, of course, de Gaulle, who's arrived in France as the liberator, people have heard of him, but they don't know what he looks like. Everyone discovers him. But here's this huge star in a Free French uniform. She is like the embodiment of the Gaullist cause, and everyone knows who she is. So she's an incredibly valuable propaganda item. And she's also telling the French people, I was a soldier. I fought on the Allied side. Now, let's not forget that there were other performers and entertainers who performed for the Germans, who performed under Vichy. I'm thinking of Edith Piaf and Maurice Chevalier, among others. And they had a rather checkered war in, they were investigated by the collaboration committees that were set up, whereas Josephine Baker surfaces as this great supporter of the French resistance who has fought on the right side, who has taken, of course, her secret activities don't actually come to light till the end of the war, but she surfaces as very much a war hero. And that uniform that she wears, she brings it out very regularly. And we understand that it's a period of her life, which I argue is really important to her and carries on being, if you like, a platform that will influence her thenceforth for the rest of her life.
How did Josephine's work in the resistance inform her later adoption of multicultural children?
Well, I think that the wartime period was really important for Josephine Baker's understanding of the power she had to promote her ideas. I mean, we see her touring across North Africa and the Middle East, promoting de Gaulle, and she knew how to work a crowd. She knew how to rouse them. And she also sees during that period, particularly when she's entertaining the American troops. Here is Josephine Baker, who leaves America in 1925, who is able to make herself an extraordinary life. And actually, from 1936 onwards, I would say distances herself not just from the US, but from African Americans in Paris. She wants to focus on being French and having a French existence. And while she's out and about working for the Free French, she sees very keenly segregation again. She's entertaining American servicemen, and she sees these African Americans standing at the back of the halls and at the back of the camps. And she has to face the realities of segregation. African American segregation was practiced very to the letter in the American military. African Americans weren't allowed to see active service. They did all the most menial tasks. They ran the canteens, buried the dead, built the bridges. And she starts to speak out. You see it in the African American and other press. She starts to speak out in favor of what she refers to as her race. She realizes that she has a platform not just for the Gaullists, but to draw attention to the African American contribution to the war. And she, like most African Americans, is very hopeful that after the war, this contribution will bring about big change in the US and bring an end to segregation. And of course, that doesn't happen. So Josephine Baker comes out of this wartime experience with a much better understanding of her own power as a celebrity and the platform she has. And she starts to become engaged in anti-racist meetings. She starts to speak out on attack American segregation. She does a series of conferences and meetings. And then she decides that she's actually going to adopt children from all over the world. And she will adopt she actually adopts 12 children in
Mm.
total and takes them to her chateau in the Dordogne, the Chateau des Milandes, and kind of brings them up there as a kind of living experiment to show the world that everyone can live peacefully and happily together, whatever the color of their skin, whatever their ethnic background, whatever their religious upbringing. And she sets up these children who become incredibly famous because of who she is and the position that she has to try and show the world that we can all live in harmony. And I think her ambition is to have lots of these kinds of colonies all over the world, and that it would take off. Of course, this doesn't happen, but this project, if you like, gained along with her now going to America, performing there, refusing to perform to segregated audiences, and she's starting to speak out, and she becomes adopted really by and a very important figure in the American civil rights movement. So I would argue that the roots of this, in order to understand this, we need to understand her wartime activities.
You've got her adopting 12 children, but with that comes the staff that need to look after the children, the education that needs to towards all the children, and that affects her costs. How does it affect the finances of her?
Well, Josephine Baker's project was a very ambitious and
Mm.
yes, I mean it looks pretty odd to us now looking back, but I think it was a worthy project. She meant well with it, but it was incredibly naive. Initially, Josephine marries in 1947. She marries her fourth husband, actually, a man called Jean Bouillon. And he takes on the project and he manages a lot of the practicalities of what is going on in the chateau. But Josephine Baker becomes more and more ambitious. She doesn't just want to have these children in the chateau, she wants to create a resort. She wants tourists to come and watch them in action and learn from that experience. So she builds bars and restaurants and swimming pools, and she wants to attract, it becomes a village des loisirs, and she wants to attract people. And the whole thing takes on a kind of momentum which is impossible. She can't, and those around her can't make it work. It's not financially viable. And the cost and the expense of bringing up these children. I mean, Josephine Baker, she brings her mother over, she brings her sister and her half brother over to help her in this endeavor. But really, it's bigger than she is. And actually, Joe Bouillon, after she brings home the sixth child, he says, enough, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't make this work. And he disappears to South America. And Josephine Baker is very naive. The local French laborers, and she doesn't know the value of money, so she gets ripped off. She pays more than she should for some of the works that go on, and she's actually getting older, and her tours aren't bringing in enough money to make the whole thing financially viable.
Mm.
So yes, in 1968 the project collapses. And although Josephine Baker launches an appeal, actually, she has many great celebrities on her side. You see in her archive, she's written to everyone. De Gaulle puts in a bit of money. She even writes to the King and Queen of England. She writes to the Queen of England. Brigitte Bardot does an appeal for her on television. And Princess Grace of Monaco actually also helps Josephine Baker, but uh, the whole project does eventually collapse, and the chateau is sold in 1968 in bankruptcy, really for a fraction of its real value. And Princess Grace takes on Josephine Baker and her family and sets them up for the rest of their lives, really. They go to live in very close to Monaco. And yeah, but that particular project does not really work out for her.
You mentioned that the tours weren't doing very well. What impact did the FBI have on those tours?
Well, the tours she did in the post-war period, she was able to generate a bit more interest in America, and she did become quite an iconic figure for later on for the gay community. But in the immediate post-war period, 1951, where she's beginning to be adopted by the African American community of Harlem, she's speaking out on behalf of the African American cause. She goes to a place called the Stork Club to celebrate that. In Harlem, they have a Josephine Baker Day, and she's heralded as this really important figure, and she loves it. She goes around, there's a motorcade. And so to celebrate her success, she goes to the Stork Club in New York, which was one of the venues of the day. And she has a very bad experience there. That she isn't served, and she gets very upset. And there's a man called Walter Winchell who is also there at that time, who witnesses what is going on, who had been very supportive of Josephine Baker's activities, but he stays quiet, and she's very confused by this. Walter Winchell is a very notorious radio personality, and he's very well known. And so she attacks him. And he's very upset by this attack. He said, I was just minding my own business. And so he retaliates and very nastily. And he puts the FBI, he says, she's a communist. And he actually puts all her war record into doubt, says, she only fought on the right side well after it was clear that the Allies were going to win. And Josephine Baker then falls under suspicion. We are in this McCarthyite period. She is dependent on the goodwill of the government, and the FBI is very suspicious about all her anti-racist civil rights activity, and makes her life very difficult. She's refused access to America, and they try to be very disparaging about her, but she doesn't actually let it shake her activities. She just carries on regardless. There is a period of time where she struggles to get into the US, and she goes and performs in South America, where she's very, very well accepted and liked. Comes back, and she is able to use her performances once again to promote this very important message of anti-segregationism. And she's picked up by the civil rights movement, and she will be involved in the March on Washington in 1963. She's one of two women who speak. She speaks just before Martin Luther King makes his incredible I Have a Dream speech. There she is in her Free French uniform, once again with all her medals. And she talked very movingly about her experience coming to Europe and being able to live a very different life from the one that would have been available to her in America. So there we are. And I've forgotten your question, but I hope that covers the ground.
It does. It does. And why does her induction into the Pantheon solidify her role as a French hero?
Well, the Pantheon is a mausoleum of all the national icons of the French Republic. It's actually very male. And it's only recently that women have been deemed to have the honor of having their ashes buried there. And President Macron decided to pantheonize, symbolically move her ashes to the Pantheon in 2021. I think we mustn't be naive about, there was probably a very political motive for that, as well as wanting to applaud Josephine Baker. He was actually at the beginning of a presidential campaign then, and Josephine Baker was a figure who could perhaps emphasize the diversity side of his program. But here she is, this African American woman who's chosen France. She chooses, rather than America, she chooses France. She is the epitome, if you like, of the French Republican Universalist model. She chooses the freedom, the universalist idea of France. And she is the first black woman and the first performer to have this honor of being one of the building blocks of the French nation. This is, the really true importance of her presence in this mausoleum. And it is a very moving experience if any of your listeners have the opportunity to go to the Pantheon to see her alongside the great men of French history, the resistors, Jean Jaurès, the writers, Victor Hugo, who are also present in this very important place to the French state. So there is a kind of extraordinary paradox that is also present, I think, during the Second World War, when reporters for Variety talk about Josephine Baker, this impoverished African American woman who comes to France and becomes the symbol of the French nation and the symbol of Paris for these French soldiers. And here she is now, the symbol of the French nation and central to French Republican memory.
Well, I think she's a fascinating individual. I think she's a very brave lady, and I think she deserves all the praise that she's got now and all the recognition that she's got.
Yeah, she is this extraordinary multifaceted figure, which actually makes her an amazing spy because she has all these different layers of identity. And so there we are. I hope people might have learned a little bit more about her today.
I hope so. And your book, Josephine Baker's Secret War, I'll put a link down below so people can get a copy. It is fascinating and a must read. Very, very important book indeed. My final question to you is, what is next for you?
Well, what's next for me? I am scanning the archives, and I do want to do write some more books that will be of interest, but I haven't quite landed on a topic. But as soon as I do, I shall crack on with it, and hopefully it'll be out before too long.
Fantastic. So, Hanna Diamond, I thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a really interesting conversation. And again, your book is a great read. So, thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about her.
You're very, very welcome. Take care now. Bye bye.
Bye.